Dr. Glenn Sunshine, a PhD in Renaissance and Reformation history from University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has served in a number of academic positions, most recently retired from Central Connecticut State University, where he's a professor of history. Glenn is an award-winning author. He has published 9 books, numerous articles, and book chapters on history and theology and culture, online and in print form on both sides of the Atlantic. His book, Why You Think the Way You Do, The Story of Western Worldviews from Rome to Home, published by Zondervan in 2009, received the 2006 Acton Institute book grant. Dr. Sunshine also wrote Slaying Leviathan, published by Canon Press in 2020. His most recent book is 32 Christians Who Changed the World, also published by Canon Press this year. Glenn has taught a variety of Bible, history, and worldview seminars and courses to churches throughout the United States, Europe, Africa, and Asia, as well as leading church retreats, seminars, and renewal weekends. He is a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. He is also the co-host of the ever-popular Theology Pugcast with our friend C.R. Wiley, who we had here last year. He is the founder of Every Square Inch Ministry, which you can find at www.esquareinch.com. He's a full-time researcher, writer, and teacher with Reflections Ministry with Dr. Ken Boa, and you can also find more of his writings at breakpoint.org. Glenn is here with his wife, Lynn. They've been married for 40 years, and they have 2 married adult children, and they now live in South Bend, Indiana, and they go to church with DJ DeYoung's mother. Please give a round of applause to Dr. Glenn Sunshine.
Yeah, thank you. After that introduction, I'm kind of interested to hear what I have to say. I do have one question, though. You've got torchlight videos in a room with a poster on William Tyndale. Think about it. Okay. Well, anyway.
We're lighting it up around here.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, William Tyndale ended his life as a guest of honor at a public barbecue. Yeah. Okay. So, I've been given an absolutely impossible job over this weekend. I've been told to go over all the important people and ideas in church history and explain why they're important for us today. As my pastor pointed out, I've got a little less than a minute a decade. So we're just going to hit highlights, and we'll see how far we actually get. Now, I want to start with the early church. The church that we think of in America, it starts in the book of Acts, and we always think of it in terms of the Roman Empire, okay? Whether it's the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Roman Catholic Church or even the Egyptian Coptic Church, all that was part of the Roman Empire. And I will continue that trend, but it's important to remember that the first kingdom that converts to Christianity officially is Armenia. The second is Rome. The third is Ethiopia. And in fact, until sometime after the year 1000, there were more Christians outside the boundaries of the old Roman Empire than inside it. So Christianity is really a global phenomenon. There were Christian communities all across Central Asia, into Africa, in India, all through this in the first centuries of the Christian era. Okay. Now, I don't have time to deal with all of that. So what we'll do is instead we'll look at the main trajectory that leads us to where we are today here. Now, as you all know, if you think of the early church, one of the first things that's going to come to mind most likely after even in the book of Acts, but certainly after you're getting out of it, is that the church experienced persecution. And now you have to understand why this persecution happened. Okay, what was it that the Romans were upset with about Christianity? Well, there were a couple of things here. First of all, well, Roman religion was pretty open-minded about things, pretty tolerant. You know, you've got your gods, I got my gods, all of that kind of thing, and that's great. Nobody claimed to have a universal God. You get sort of that in Neoplatonism, but I'm not going to explain this in any more detail, but you can have the other gods too. Christians come along and say, yeah, you know what? There's only one God. Now, the Jews believed that, and everybody knew the Jews believed that, but everybody also knew that the Jews were weird, so we didn't have to worry about that. But isn't this really rather arrogant for you to claim you've got the only God? You've got the only way to heaven? Does that sound vaguely familiar? Okay, let's add another thing. The Christian message is that your salvation depends on a Jew, again, that weird group of people, who lived in what was considered really the lowest province in the Roman Empire, Judea, who was condemned in a Roman court and crucified. Now, crucifixion, we're used to thinking about this sort of, but what you got to understand is that crucifixion in the Roman Empire was considered so ugly and so degrading that the word wasn't even used in polite company. Okay, so you're telling me that I got to put my faith in this crucified Jew in Judea in order for me to get salvation? Are you nuts? Paul talks about the offense of the cross. These are two of the major issues. The offense of the cross that Paul talks about and the claim of exclusivity. The claim that there is one and only one God, you should worship that one, and we can't worship any of the other gods out here. Okay? There were a couple of other complaints, by the way. Ritual cannibalism in the Lord's Supper. They thought the Christian language was we were eating Jesus' body and drinking his blood, and if you take that in the literal sense, they actually thought Christians engaged in cannibalism, at least some people did. And the other thing is that Christians would talk about what we call the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist. They called it a love feast. Now, everybody knows what love is code for. So they accused Christians of engaging in orgies. Okay? Now, the irony there is that that was actually really common in the Roman Empire among the pagans, so why complain about it if you think Christians are doing it? But they did anyway. So those were the sorts of things Christians were accused of. And along with that, really the critical one that got under the emperor's skin is that in Rome, the basic concept of a deity is the person who is the supreme authority in a particular area of life. Thus, for example, if you're going to go on the ocean or on the sea, Mediterranean Sea, you need to recognize that Neptune, we're in Rome. Neptune is the one who's in charge of the sea. He is the supreme authority over the sea. So you need to give Neptune a sacrifice, basically saying, I know I'm going through your backyard, please don't squash me. Okay? So that's the way they related to gods. Now, here's the thing. The Roman emperor is the supreme authority in the political world. Therefore, the Roman emperor can be considered a god. And by refusing to worship the emperor, the Christians were seen as disloyal. They were seen as treasonous. Okay? The confession, the basic confession of faith in Christianity is Jesus is Lord. What that means is Caesar isn't. And that was one thing Caesar wouldn't tolerate. So for all of these reasons, Christians start getting persecuted. There's a whole lot of different things working together here. By the way, Caesar is Lord, We don't quite word it that way, but sometimes people act that way today. And if a church decides that they don't want to go along with government mandates, for example, don't meet for worship, they're considered what? Disloyal, they're considered, well, lawbreakers, certainly. All kinds of other things follow from that. Really, in many ways, we're in a situation not identical, certainly, to the Christians in Rome. Nobody's being executed. But many of the same kinds of pressures that faced the early Christians are, in fact, facing us today in sort of a lower level of intensity. But we've got many of the same kinds of issues that are still at play for us. And we'll talk there are reasons for that, which I hope I'll get to before the end of the hour. But, excuse me, 45 minutes. Okay, so what do the Christians do? Well, the Christians develop defenses against these things. There's a group of early Christian writers that are known as the apologists. Apologia in Greek means a defense. It doesn't mean I'm sorry. They're not apologizing for being Christians, but they're doing apologetics. And what they do is they will answer the accusations against Christians. No, we don't do ritual cannibalism. No, we're not engaging in orgies. We live just like the rest of you guys live. And in fact, in many ways, we hold much higher standards of behavior than you do. We don't kill our babies. We don't abort babies. We won't do those things. So no, we aren't these immoral people you're talking about. By the way, if you want to get into morality, have you ever actually looked at what you say your own gods do? So they start attacking paganism that way. And they muster all kinds of defenses to try to explain Christianity. A lot of it is really not so much going on the attack or whatever. It's trying to get people to understand what Christianity really is about. And to do that, among other things, they're going to start using Greek philosophy, because Greek philosophy was the dominant intellectual environment in the Roman Empire. And so as educated Christians come to faith, they bring with it the tools that they learned through Greek philosophy. And so they're going to begin using categories from Greek philosophy to help people understand what Christianity is about. This is already occurring in the New Testament. When the Gospel of John says, in the beginning was the Logos, in the beginning was the Word, he's picking up a word that is a very important word in Greek thought. And the way he uses it, the way he talks about what the Logos does, aligns exactly with Neoplatonism, it aligns with Stoicism, and so on. This is already occurring in the New Testament. The apologists are going to take this further. They're also going to address competitors to Christianity, the most important of which is one called Gnosticism. That's spelled G-N, Gnosticism. It comes from the Greek word gnosis, and in Greek the G is pronounced. Gnosis, which means knowledge. The idea in Gnosticism is that we're saved through some form of secret knowledge. Okay, that's it. Secret knowledge. You got to know the key in order to get salvation. The physical universe is bad. The physical universe is evil. The spirit is what's good. And so what we need to do is get the secret knowledge that will enable us to free our spirit from the material world. That's the basic idea in Gnosticism. The type of knowledge can vary a great deal. There are a million different Gnostic sects out there. One of them, Valentinian Gnosticism, as an example. Valentinian Gnosticism was based on the idea that, well, okay, the way they understood the world, the Earth is a sphere in the center of the universe. Around it is a crystalline sphere that has the moon on it. Around that is another crystalline sphere which has Mars, and so on. So all of the planets, which by the way include the sun and moon, all of the planets are on these crystalline spheres going out from the center of the Earth. And each of these is in fact ruled by angelic being. Okay? Now, in order to get salvation in Valentinian Gnosticism, what you have to do is you have to learn the passwords that will allow you to pass through these different spheres until you can get outside the sphere of the fixed stars and then rejoin God. That's your gnosis. That's your secret knowledge. So you got to know the passwords. Okay. And the thing that I find mind-boggling is that people took this seriously, but evidently they did. Now, this is a major competitor to Christianity because they actually claim to be the real Christians. You see, the God of the Old Testament is evil. How do we know that? What's the first verse in the Bible? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created the material world. The material world is evil. Thus, the Old Testament God must be evil. The New Testament God, however, the New Testament God is a God of spirit and light and love, not this dark material evil muck down here. And Jesus comes to free us from the God of the Old Testament to this God of sweetness and light in the New Testament. That's what they're claiming. As a matter of fact, there are some Gnostics who go so far as to fall into what is technically called docetism, the idea that Jesus didn't actually have a physical body. He only appeared. The word dokeo in Greek, from which we get docetism, means to appear or to seem to be. Jesus only seemed to have a physical body. He didn't really have one. And as a matter of fact, there are Gnostic Gospels that talk about Jesus laughing on the cross because these idiots out there actually think they could kill him. Welcome to Gnosticism. Okay. So the Christians start very early on in 2nd century. Irenaeus is going to write against the Gnostics to try to show that they're just completely off base here. Now, by the way, in case you're wondering, we are currently living in a world that is full of neo-Gnostics. Where does this come in? Well, what is the basic argument for transgender? Your body is irrelevant to who you are. Who you are is who you are on the inside, and by that they don't mean your viscera. Okay? Who you are on the inside. What's your soul? What's your mind? You know, this is who you really are, and your body is irrelevant to that. So you can either, declare yourself to be the opposite, gender or sex. They're increasingly using both of them. Whatever your body is, and you can leave your body that way and it doesn't matter, you're still this other thing. Or you can decide that, no, I need to surgically alter my body to look like what I think I should look like. But either way, the point is that your body is irrelevant to your identity. We're in Gnosticism. And by the way, the same kind of thing occurs in ancient Gnosticism in one sense, where some of the Gnostics go to the extreme on asceticism, and others go on the extreme to say, well, since the body and the soul are two completely different things, it doesn't matter at all what I do with my body. My soul is going to still be okay because I got the knowledge, I got the inside track here. And so they end up living lives of sexual license and gluttony and things like that. On the other hand, you have extreme ascetics. Gnosticism could go both ways. Transgenderism can, in a sense, go both ways. You can either keep the body you've got even though you identify as something else, and that is who you really are, or you can alter your body to make it look like what you think you are. There are real parallels here. Our world is becoming increasingly closer and closer to Rome. So anyway, the apologists are out here making these arguments. Justin Martyr is one of the early ones. Irenaeus is really important, and so on. But there's another line of argumentation that's important as well, and this is the line of argumentation going at the political side of things. Tertullian 2nd century church father, all the way up to Lactantius, another important one in the 4th century, not as well known. They're all through this period, they're making a critical argument about the role of religion, or to be more precise, religious liberty in the state. The basic argument is this. Worship that is coerced is not pleasing to God. The only worship that is pleasing to God is worship that is given to him voluntarily. Now, if that is the case, then the state must allow for religious liberty. It cannot coerce anyone to worship in a way that they don't believe. And so this is an argument that the Christians are making. And it is actually the Christians who make the first argument for religious liberty in history anywhere. So the Christians are arguing for this. And now Lactantius, the guy I mentioned, Tertullian to Lactantius. Lactantius, it turns out, as a Christian, was the tutor to, well, back up a step. The Roman Empire had gotten too big to rule effectively. There was problems, particularly in the 3rd century. There was a major crisis with succession and things like that. So an emperor named Diocletian, who, by the way, is the one who instituted the worst persecution of Christians in Roman history, Diocletian developed a system where he divided the empire east and west, and then each of those were divided in half as well. There is, in the west and in the east, each of them has a senior emperor who is called an Augustus, and a junior emperor called a Caesar. The junior emperor is the heir, the son, heir, adopted or otherwise, of the Augustus. When the Augustus dies or retires, the Caesar gets promoted to Augustus, and his son becomes the new Caesar. So this is a way to try to stop the problems of that you saw in the crisis in the 3rd century, where in a 30-year period there were 50 different people who claimed the throne. Okay, so you're trying to avoid that. So he sets this up, and one of the Caesars, who was centered in the city of Trier in Germany, is a guy by the name of Constantine. Constantine had Lactantius as the tutor for his children. So Constantine knew Lactantius really well. Then, when Diocletian retires, initially the succession works the way he wanted it to, but then things start breaking down, and there's another civil war. And at the civil war, Constantine said he had a vision of a Christian symbol. It's a Chi-Rho, X. It looks like an X with a P superimposed over it. That's actually the Greek letters Chi and Rho, which are the first 2 letters of the word Christos, or Christ. He had a vision of this, and with the words, "In this sign conquer." So Constantine ordered all of his troops to paint the Chi-Rho on their shields, and at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, he defeated his opponent and became the sole emperor of Rome. The following year, in 313, he issues something called the Edict of Milan. Now, the Edict of Milan is regularly misrepresented. What the Edict of Milan did was it said that since worship of God had to be given voluntarily, religious liberty is now the case in Rome. We have religious liberty now. This has the effect of legalizing Christianity. But it wasn't specifically about Christianity. He was following Lactantius's lead in arguing that, in decreeing religious freedom inside the empire. And like I said, this had the effect of legalizing Christianity. And on top of that, Constantine began worshiping God. And when the emperor begins worshiping God, people around the emperor think, oh, this might be a really good idea, and they begin doing it too. So you begin getting a large-scale conversion of people to Christianity following the emperor. Now, there's a lot of debate over whether Constantine was really a Christian, whether this conversion was sincere. Personally, I think it was. And let me give you the arguments pro and con here. Constantine, that guy. Constantine did issue coins and things like that that had images of Roman gods on them after after he said he'd become a Christian. Constantine actually ended up having one of his sons executed, which one would think is not something one should do as a Christian. And Constantine wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed. These are the three basic arguments against his conversion. The first I don't really have an answer for, except these were traditional coins used in the empire, so he just continued to do it. Second, execution of his son. Well, his son was implicated in a plot to assassinate him. And under those circumstances, any king in this period would have offed the kid. Deathbed baptism. Well, at this point, Christians believed, in the words of the Apostles' Creed, I acknowledge one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. Nicene Creed, whatever. When I get baptized, my sins are forgiven. What if I screw it up afterwards? What happens then? How can I get my sins forgiven after baptism? Can I get them forgiven? So this is a question that starts being asked around, and it wasn't unusual for people who converted to Christianity to wait until they were dying before they got baptized so they didn't have a chance to screw it up. Okay. So Constantine's actions is perfectly in keeping with a lot of what was going on then. Now, theologians like Augustine and others are going to argue strenuously against this understanding of baptism, but it was still one that was circulating at the time. So the arguments against him aren't really that strong. There may be a little bit of syncretism early on. What about the arguments for his conversion? Well, he sends his mother Helena to the Holy Land looking for physical evidence of Jesus' life. She's the one who identifies, talking to Palestinian Christians who maintained knowledge of these things over the centuries, where was Jesus born? Where was he buried? Where was Golgotha? All of these kinds of things. She's the one who identifies firmly and sets in place where these things were, talking to the local Christians. He sends her out to look for the places and the evidence. If he wasn't a Christian, I don't know why he would do that. He also, frankly, this is another part of the argument, supposedly the Christians were a rising and powerful group and he wanted their backing to become emperor, except for the fact that Christians were in the Western Empire about 5% and maybe 20% in the East, and they were terribly unpopular. This was not a move that was going to consolidate his hold over the Roman population. It overestimates tremendously the number of Christians that are actually there. So in a lot of ways, this was a bad move for him politically, because like I said, the Christians were really unpopular with the vast majority of the Roman public. And Constantine was a good enough politician, he'd have understood what the equation was there. So for all these reasons, I think Constantine's conversion was sincere. I'm not sure how well he understood Christianity, especially early on, but I think it was in fact sincere. And that changes the whole ballgame, because now Christianity is legal, and that creates a whole different kind of environment. It creates problems that are going to continue lasting until today. One of them being, how do church and state relate to each other? Every other major world religion that that develops with the support of the government. The religion always has support of the government. That's the only way it becomes a major religion. Christianity existed for 300 years as a sporadically persecuted minority faith. What this says is that the church can exist as an independent entity separate from the government. Now, in the Roman Empire, up to this point, there really wasn't anything except maybe the family that existed apart from the government. So suddenly Christianity is there. And now the question is, how do you divide the power between them? Where does the state's authority end and the church's begin? Or where does the church's end and the state begins? This tension between church and state is a major theme from this point on, occasionally leading to literally hot wars, from this point on through church history. But it's because of the fact that there is a separation in Christianity. By definition, there must be a distinction between church and state. And so that balance of power thing is going to be something that's going to continue to haunt us literally up to today. Okay? So that's a little bit about Constantine. But there's one other thing Constantine is really remembered for, and that is the Council of Nicaea in 325. Now, to understand the Council of Nicaea, we need to understand that in the early church, there was a lot of debate over exactly how you understand who Jesus is. Pretty much everybody recognized that Jesus was human, except for the Docetists that I talked about before. Pretty much everybody recognized that he was human. But the question is, what else is he? Because he's obviously something more than just a man. So what is he? Some early Christians thought Jesus was actually an angel. Some people would argue an archangel like Michael. Other people, so there was a whole series of debates about this. Ultimately, the church would decide that, well, no, Jesus can't be at least a normal angel because we worship him. John worships him in Revelation. Thomas confesses him as my Lord and my God. So he's not that. But what is he? Now, the problem we have here is actually in the Gospel of John. Jesus says, whoever has seen me has seen my Father. In the same discourse, he says, you should be glad that I'm leaving because I'm going to my Father and my Father is greater than I. My Father is greater than I and the Father are one. How do we make these things work together? Well, there was a guy by the name of Arius who came along, and Arius said, well, Jesus is less than the Father. The Father is greater than he is. So Jesus is the first created being through whom God created everything else. This raised the ire of another theologian by the name of Athanasius, who insisted that Jesus was actually God incarnate. And these two, the supporters on each side, got into a knockdown, drag-out fight, which sometimes literally was a fight physically. Well, one of the traditional roles of the Roman emperor was to mediate in disputes that existed within religions. If the priests of Jupiter got into an argument, it was the emperor's role to mediate. So you're seeing the Christians getting into an argument with each other. So the emperor says, all right, let's get all the bishops together at Nicaea, over here, right across the Bosporus from my new capital city, Constantinople, or New Rome as he called it. Let's get all the bishops together here and we'll thrash this out. And so the bishops assembled there. And according to the reports, many of these bishops had been tortured under Diocletian, his predecessor. And according to reports we have from it, Constantine actually went and kissed the wounds of these bishops. And they have this debate there, and they decide on the basis of both scripture and what had been confessed by the church consistently over in their liturgies, what the church's confession had been, that Jesus was God. One of the interesting incidents that probably didn't really happen, but I wish it did, during this, is that St. Nicholas of Myra was at the council, and according to tradition, he was so upset when Arius said there was a time when Jesus wasn't, when the second person of the Trinity, we didn't talk about Trinity, there was a time when the Christ didn't exist. Arius got so upset that he went over and slapped him. Now, St. Nicholas of Myra is the historical person that eventually in folklore turns into Santa Claus. So the idea of Santa Claus going and belting Arius just really appeals to me. But in any event, the decision is made that orthodoxy, Jesus is God, is what will be taught in the churches. This is it. Constantine has nothing to do with the decision. The decision is made by the bishops. He didn't dictate this, contrary to what you will frequently hear. These bishops who had stood up to Diocletian, do you think that they're going to bend under Constantine? I don't think so. So Constantine had nothing to do with the decision. It was the bishops who decide this. Now, this doesn't completely end the controversy. There are continuing problems that are going to come from this. Okay, Jesus is God and Jesus is man. How do we understand this? There are two major intellectual centers for Christianity in this period. One of them is in Alexandria in Egypt. The other is in Antioch in Syria. And in Alexandria, they tend to use their approach to biblical exegesis tends to focus on allegory and things like that. In Antioch, it tends to focus much more on the literal side of things. In Alexandria, heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, they say, well, Jesus's human nature must have been completely, when the second person of the Trinity is incarnated in this human being, his human nature must be completely obliterated by God, so he has only a divine nature. He is one person with one nature. In Antioch, they said, no. Jesus had a human nature. We know that. He died on the cross. I mean, he gets into discussions with the Father about what the Father's will really is. Is there any way I can get out of this? So he's got a human nature. So he's got a human nature and he's got a divine nature. He's got two natures and they're two persons. One nature, one person, two nature, two persons. That's the debate. And this comes to a head when one of the patriarchs in Constantinople, a guy named Nestorius, says, okay, traditionally we talk about Mary, Jesus' mother, as the Theotokos. The Catholics translate this as Mother of God. It actually means God-bearer, the one who bears God. Okay. He says that's not really right because Mary only bore Jesus' human nature. We should call her the Christotokos, the Christ-bearer. Well, you mess with the liturgy, you get people really upset. And the net result is that Nestorius got charged with heresy, and there's a whole series of different councils here. Nestorius is charged with heresy. There's a condemnation of him. There's a condemnation of his teacher, a guy by the name of Theodore of Mopsuestia. That's important, which I'll explain in a minute, and so on. Ultimately, like I said, there'll be competing councils here. The Monophysites win for a little while, but ultimately, in 451, a council at Chalcedon will meet, which will say, all right, what we've got in Jesus is a single person who exists or who subsists in two natures. He has both a fully human nature and a fully divine nature, but they're united in a single person. Now, this is different from what either side had said before, but I think they really came up with the right answer. The problem is that when the council condemned Theodore of Mopsuestia, Nestorius' teacher, The Church of the East, which is the church that is centered in the Persian Empire, outside the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, they saw Theodore as their principal theologian. And by condemning Theodore, that meant that the entire Church of the East rejected everything else that occurred in any of the churches in the old Roman Empire. Why is that important? That's the Iraqi church today, the Church of Iraq. The Nestorian church, as it's called, was technically it's the Church of the East. The traditional Iraqi Christians and all of that are part of this. They're going to engage in missionary activity all the way out to China. In the 600s, they are establishing churches in China. So all of Central Asia is actually evangelized by Nestorians. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this distinction that's being made at Chalcedon works in Greek, but it doesn't work in a lot of other languages. So if you read Nestorian writings from China, for example, there's nothing in there that an Orthodox Christian would reject. Yet technically, because they don't accept these councils, technically they're classified as heretics, even though they can say the creeds and everything else with us. This is one of the problems when we start trying to define things too precisely, I think. Okay, so that's the first two major themes that we can talk about in the early church: persecution and apologetics, and along with that, then the whole church-state issue. All of that is one set of things. But the other is what you could think of as hammering the dents out of orthodoxy. What is it that is Orthodox Christianity? What is the truth about Christ? How do we understand that? So we get at this point the doctrine of the Trinity. We get the doctrine of the two natures in one person in Christ. All of that is hammered out in this early church period. There are a couple of other developments that are worth noting, however. One of them is the development of monasticism. Monasticism really begins when people living, particularly in Egypt, are trying to figure out how do they live Christian lives in the midst of a decadent culture. It's just too difficult to do this. How do you do this? So a number of them, most notably a guy by the name of Antony, will leave Alexandria and go out and live along the Nile River in the desert. And there they will try to live a very ascetic life, a very strict lifestyle, growing their own vegetables, living in a little hut that they make for themselves and all of that as a hermit. Because they think that living in the city, living in Alexandria or in the culture is just, it's just too compromising. Antony becomes really famous, and the net result is a whole lot of other people come out to Antony and say, hey, I want to join you. He's a hermit. Antony, this kind of leaves Antony scratching his head. But ultimately what he develops is what's technically called a skeet monastery. He sets all of the monks up in their own little hermitages. They've all got their own little shelter, and they grow their own food, and they do their own private devotions, and they pray and they wrestle with the devil and all of these kinds of things. But they come together collectively to worship, and if there's a problem, other people can come and assist them. That's the beginning of monasticism. This becomes really famous because Athanasius, the guy who argued against Arius, wrote a biography of Antony. And this biography caused a real stir, and a lot of people decided that they needed to do things like this. It leads more people to go out into the desert. They become known as the Desert Fathers or the Desert Mothers. There are others, like, well, my favorite is a guy in the area around Syria named Simon Stylites. Simon, he didn't have a desert handy, so he decided that what he would do is live his life on top of a pillar. He went up the pillar. He would, drop a bucket down and people would put food in and he'd bring it up and so on. And he just lived on the pillar as a hermit. And he got a reputation, because of this, he got a reputation for being a very wise man. And so people would come to him and they would shout up and ask him questions, and he would shout down answers. And by the way, when this became a little bit too easy for him, he decided that rather than just standing on the pillar, he'd stand on one foot. I'm not making this up. This is real. Okay. So now, being fair to Simon, it's hard, but trying to be fair to Simon, if you look at the questions and answers, there's actually a great deal of wisdom in what he had to say. He really did have a great deal of insight into spirituality and human behavior and so on. So monasticism is then going to grow. It's going to take other more sophisticated forms. St. Basil the Great is going to establish the pattern that is going to be used in the Eastern world, in what we today call the Orthodox world. Benedict of Nursia is going to set up a pattern that will eventually become dominant in the West. Although there are other influences as well, notably we'll talk about tomorrow from the Celtic Church. The Irish Church is really underestimated in history. One last person in the Church Father era that we do need to mention is St. Augustine, Augustine of Hippo. Augustine is hands down the most important theologian for the Latin world. That includes us, the Latin-speaking half of the Roman Empire. Augustine himself went through a whole series of phases. His mother was a Christian, but he wasn't. He went through a whole series of phases through a variety of different religious, philosophical sects, until eventually he came kicking and screaming into the kingdom, almost in a sense, sort of like C.S. Lewis. But he comes to faith. He's an incredibly well-trained orator, philosopher, all of these things. And he goes back home to a city called Hippo Regius in North Africa, and he is promptly elected bishop. He didn't want the job. He actually hid, but he becomes bishop. He then becomes involved in pretty much all of the major controversies facing the Western Church. The first of these is something called Donatism. It's really important that you understand Donatism. Donatus was a priest who, under Diocletian's persecution, did not give up. He'd been tortured and everything else, but he was absolutely firm. Other Christian priests and bishops sometimes weren't quite so tough, and they would give copies of the scriptures, which the Romans would then destroy, or things like that. After Christianity becomes legal, those priests who had knuckled under persecution went to their superiors, confessed, did penance, were absolved, and continued. Donatus said no. If they gave in under persecution, that proves that they were never legitimately priests in the first place. Which means, by the way, that all the sacraments they've ever done, all the baptisms and things like that, none of them are valid because they weren't legitimately priests. Now, this causes a whole lot of disruption, and it eventually makes its way to the emperor. The emperor says, all right, you guys have to decide this. Let's get this worked out. He talks to the bishops, and he decides the Donatists are wrong. The Donatists aren't happy with this, and they riot. The emperor then proceeds to crush them. Now, Augustine's role in this, two things. First of all, he writes against the Donatists. He says, look, a sacrament is effective, and sacraments are really important to people in this period. A sacrament is effective not on the basis of the worth of the person doing the sacrament, but on the basis of the worth of Christ. Christ himself is the substance of the sacraments. Every priest is going to be imperfect. It's not the priest that matters, it's Christ. What this means then is Donatism generally, which is now considered a heresy, and I think properly so. Donatism, well, maybe properly. Donatism says that you don't judge the quality of a ministry by the minister. You know, if a priest is duly ordained and does the sacrament right, the sacrament is effective. Again, sacraments are central here, not preaching, not in this era. That's going to be an issue that's going to keep coming up as we see corrupt clergy in the church. And it's actually the question that is consistently asked of people today. Yeah, what about all of those scandals involving these preachers? We get the same question all the time. It's effectively the Donatism question. Okay. The less savory part of Augustine's contribution to this is that he said, well, in Scripture, in the parable of the wedding feast, the master of the feast tells his servants to compel them to enter. You know, go to the highways and byways and compel them to enter. Gag them and drag them into the feast. Okay. Augustine says that applies to heretics. We don't coerce non-Christians into faith. That's wrong. Because if you're going to become a Christian, you have to do it from the heart. It can't be something that's coerced. But if someone claims to be a Christian and is a heretic, you can force them back to orthodoxy. So he approves the emperor's use of force against the Donatists. This is going to be the core that is going to lead to everything from inquisitions to witch hunting. Augustine's biggest mistake, I would argue. So you have the Donatist controversy. There are several others. The other one, though, that I want to mention, and I'm already over time, is the Pelagian controversy. Pelagius was a British monk who argued that your salvation is something that you have to earn for yourself. Nothing anybody else does can affect you spiritually. So you didn't inherit sin from Adam. Your sins are on you. You've got to live a good and holy and righteous life in order to make it to heaven. Because you see, if nothing anybody else does can affect your spiritual state, if you don't inherit sin from Adam, you can't inherit righteousness from Christ. His work doesn't save you. That's functionally where this leads. Augustine looked at this and blew a gasket. And he said, no, this is absolutely wrong. And Augustine then goes after Pelagius and effectively demolishes his position using scripture and other types of argumentation. Augustine, therefore, argues very strongly for a form of predestination. If your salvation depends on what you do, it doesn't depend first and foremost on God. Augustine's argument is salvation always must begin with God because of original sin. There's nothing that we can do to initiate this process. It has to start from God. And thus there has to be predestination. So Augustine becomes, even though people had talked a little bit about predestination before this, predestination becomes really a central part of theology because of Augustine. Well, what do you do about free will then? You know, Pelagius is arguing very much a strong free will side of things. If it's all predestination, then our will doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we do, it's all up to God, right? Well, not so fast, Augustine says. What is free will? This is one of these key things to keep in mind when you're doing the free will predestination discussion, which you may have with people. I've had multiple times. What is free will? How do you define free will? You know, some people think free will is yeah, you can do this or you can do that. There's, it could go either way. You just sort of decide. No, 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 no. That's not what free will is. Free will is you have the ability to do what you want to do. Very simple common sense definition. If you've got free will, you can do what you want to do. So Augustine says, all right, that's the key to it. The problem is that because of Adam, we don't want to do the right things. Because of Adam, the one thing we do not want is God on God's own terms. The place where original sin affects us is in our loves, in our desires, in our wants. And because we want the wrong things, we inevitably will choose the wrong things by our own free will. As Augustine puts it, our will is conditioned by the weight of our love, and our loves are disordered. The net result is no one will choose God on their own. They can't because they don't love him. The only way this changes is if God intervenes in your heart and changes your love so that you begin desiring him for himself. And once that happens, by the weight of your love, your own free will cause you to choose him. So free will and predestination are not in any way incompatible. The only way, the problem is we don't understand what either of them means. Predestination occurs when God chooses people whose hearts he will change so that they then pursue him, rather than continuing in their life in opposition to him. So Augustine actually, he's considered the father of predestination, but he actually has a system, I think a very, very effective way of reconciling both divine sovereignty and salvation and human free will. Okay, so that's a really, I think I did a little more than 1 minute a decade, I'm not entirely sure. But that's a really fast run through of many of the major themes within the early church. I think we've got Q&A now?
Yep.
Okay.
If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
I'm glad I brought my notes.
Yes, Dr. Sunshine. So I guess speaking of the Gnosticism and the secret knowledge and things, I was just interested in how you're relating, the early Gnostics to like forms of Gnosticism today. To kind of maybe just hear your thoughts for a moment on like Bodhi Bakum talks about ethnic Gnosticism, and there's things that I can't know because of where my color of my skin or my nationality or different things. So kind of can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I would say that the place where Gnosticism shows up most pointedly is in the example I gave of transgenderism. However, there are other things, particularly in the broad-based world of critical theory, which includes LGBTQ stuff, but it also includes critical race theory, it includes some forms of radical feminism, it includes some forms of environmentalism, and so on. There are other forms of sort of Gnostic ideas that come up there. Bodhi Bakum's comment about ethnic Gnosticism is, I think, exactly right. What he says is that by the fact that people of color have a different lived experience, they know what racism is, and white people don't. It is a kind of knowledge that they have that is non-empirical, it is entirely intuitive, but they know it when they see it. And that intuitive sense that I know what it is when I see it is a form of Gnosticism. It is based entirely on intuition, and it's a kind of secret knowledge only possessed by people in this category. So I think that's how, I think Voddie's term is exactly right there. That's what is going on at that point. Now, I refuse to believe that I was so clear that nobody has any questions. Come on. Got one over here.
Thanks. Different denominations make claims for sort of repristinating or like making new the life of the early church. You've discussed something that seems a bit different than that. Can you maybe, for our sake, talk about some of the current claims to be like the early church and how that relates to what you've taught us?
Yeah, every reform movement in the church claims to be going back to the early church, and none of them do. And there are a lot of reasons for that. The early church existed in a particular cultural context. Our cultural context is radically different. You shouldn't expect the church to look the same. I think that, properly speaking, we can look to the early church for, and especially to Scripture, but to the early church for principles of, for example, how the church ought to be organized and things like that. But those principles have to be translated into a totally different cultural context. You know, in the ancient world, pretty much everything was run by a council of elders. The Roman Senate, the word Senate comes from the word senex, which means an old man, an elder. It's interesting that senator is cognate to the word senile. You know, so but everything is run by a council of elders. So what does the early church do? They set up a council of elders. How is the Roman Empire organized? The Roman Empire is organized around cities which govern the surrounding territories. So you have a council of elders, plural, but in the New Testament epistles, you have references to an episcopus, a bishop, singular. Elders tend to be plural, I think always plural, but episcopus is always singular. So the idea is, very early in the church, the senior elder emerges as the episcopus, the overseer. Since the cities oversaw the countryside in the Roman context, it was natural for the church in the city, with the bishop and the elders there, to oversee the churches in the surrounding area. This is going to evolve into what we see organizationally, particularly in the Orthodox Church. They get it right, the Catholic Church gets it wrong on this one. How do we know that? Council of Nicaea. You read the minutes of Nicaea, it's very clear that they're saying that certain key bishops have authority over their areas that cannot be abridged. Rome doesn't get top billing here, okay? So, but you see, that's an organic development that occurs within that cultural context. How do we take that and apply it elsewhere? Well, that's a problem that keeps coming up structurally. That's a problem that keeps coming up over and over in churches. We're going to see multiple iterations of this. The Catholic churches can go one direction, Orthodox churches can go another. Protestants come along, you know what Protestants do? They set up state churches. Invariably, okay? But then state churches start breaking down, so what do we do then? You know, there's a whole lot of different dynamics that are going on the organizational side. And that's really where a lot of the problems come up, a lot of the claims. The other one, of course, is how you worship. When you look at 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, that passage is the ultimate example of how to worship for charismatic churches. Okay, that's how they think that's what New Testament worship looks like. Well, yeah, it's a little more complicated than that. Because as it turns out, when you look at the earliest commentators who are talking about those passages, it doesn't mean what it looks like it means. When it says everyone can pray or prophesy in turn, the early church understood that as being in this letter, that's addressing the elders in the church. Ooh, wait a minute. You mean that's just referring to the elders? The text doesn't say that. Well, that's how it was understood at the time. Or in the closest centuries where we have comments on it, that's how it was understood. And that's how it was understood consistently up until probably the 20th century. So what does a return to early church worship look like? We don't know. The only thing we know for sure about what the early church did is they had preaching, they sang psalms, there was some form of liturgical prayers, and they celebrated the sacraments, baptism and communion. That's all we're really sure of. So what does a return to the early church look like in terms of worship? We don't know. But everybody tries to do it. Every reform movement tries to go back to the early church, which is a good instinct. It's what they should try to do. But we have to realize that there's a problem with translating what we see in the New Testament, which we don't always understand. What does it mean that baptism for the dead? We don't understand everything that's being said there. But to try to extract from it principles that we can understand to apply in the present, I think is what we really need to be doing. And we got to be really careful about reading too much into just a bare reading of the text without paying attention to that broader context. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's where it went for me, so I hope it did.
You mentioned how the church fathers used Greek philosophy. Let me think for a second, had this perfectly worded out. Aside from the controversies and the Gnosticism you mentioned, we know that the secular world tends to influence the church. Were there cases that the use of Greek philosophy infused the early church too much, and what were some of those?
Okay, Adolf Harnack argues that very, very strongly, that the early church was Hellenistic and that it was infected by Greek philosophy. And this idea has really permeated a lot of theological and biblical studies. I'm not convinced. What you see happening is the apologists and Christian writers will use Greek philosophy where it is useful and compatible with Christianity, but reject it at other points. So for example, Aristotle argues that God is the unmoved mover, the one who originates the universe. Okay, great. We can use that idea, but here's the problem. Aristotle says that this did not occur in time, this occurred in eternity. So the universe is eternally old. No, that's wrong. We know God started it. The same thing with Neoplatonism. God is the origin of everything. God made everything through the Logos. That much is right. But this, again, was an eternal thing. It happened in eternity. The universe is eternally old. No, that's wrong. The Christians were able to grab the appropriate ideas, the ideas that they could use to convey biblical truth and actually to further develop biblical truth, while at the same time having the discernment to reject the things that were incompatible with it. Was there too much Greek philosophy? Yeah, especially in the Middle Ages. Okay, but we'll talk about that tomorrow. But I think that the idea that Christianity was ruined or poisoned or something by Hellenization is just wrong. I just think it doesn't work. And if you want somebody really good on this, Tom Price, one of my co-hosts on the podcast, talks about this a lot. So.
If I'm asking a question preemptively, just tell me to stop. But this is about kind of the East-West division in the church. So you mentioned Augustine as kind of the preeminent theologian of the Western church. And I guess I'm interested if you can summarize or delineate particularly how the Eastern Church would differ on the two particular questions that you discussed, original sin and also the question of predestination and free will.
Yeah, I was about to say that's 10:54. That's tomorrow. But you're asking a different question, and your question's a good one. The Eastern Church recognizes Augustine as a saint and as a theologian. He doesn't play as prominent a role in Orthodox theology, but they accept him as a theological teacher, as a valid teacher, as one of the church fathers, as a saint. Okay. The thing you have to remember about Eastern Orthodoxy is they have a radically different understanding of what salvation is than we do. And the reason for that, again, is stuff from tomorrow, but the short version of it is that when there was a recovery of education in the Middle Ages, around the 11th century, it started in law schools. And then it moved to theology. And so Anselm comes along and comes up with the idea of forensic atonement, the idea that what's happening is sort of a legal thing where God forgives our sins because of Christ. He's doing that because the intellectual climate of the day is centered on legal studies, and he's taking ideas from legal studies and then applying them into theology. And that then sets the groundwork for everything that happens after it when it comes to salvation in the Western Church. In the Eastern Church, they work out of 2 Peter 1, where we become partakers of the divine nature. Technically, the term is theosis in Greek, or divinization in Latin. The idea here is that what salvation is becoming progressively more and more like Christ and more united to him. That's the core of what salvation is. They talk about, they acknowledge forgiveness of sins and all of that, but they don't bother with any of the legal issues. They just focus on that. And so the kinds of questions Augustine is wrestling with Pelagius and so on, don't apply in as direct a way in the Eastern understanding of salvation as they do in the Latin world. So the relationship's complicated.
Just curious why you discount the account of St. Nicholas smiting Arius at council.
Yeah, there are two reasons for that. Number one, it's a rather late account. It's a late story. Secondly, it isn't clear that either of them was actually at the council. My daughter actually wrote a version of A Visit from St. Nicholas, which is the proper name for A Night Before Christmas, based on that incident. Twas the night before the council, and all through Nicaea, the people were discussing an important idea or something like that. And then it goes on from that. My daughter is a lot more clever than I am.
She even rhymed homoousius.
She even worked homoousius into it, which you'll notice I didn't go there today. Anything else for tonight? Going once, going twice.
Sold. All right.
Somebody got his hand up right at the end, right just before.
Just quick question. We hear about persecution in the early church from Rome. Was that going on anywhere else?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. There was persecution in the Persian Empire. St. Thomas in India was murdered. You see it in other places as well. We always hear about it in Rome because, frankly, we don't pay any attention to the Persian Empire, which as a historian I would say is a really big mistake, but there you have it. Okay, thank you.